Okay, so if we're going into the mailbag, a couple questions from the episode, part two of episode two. The first one comes from a former classmate I had in high school who had a question. When you talked about Cuban slavery versus colonial slavery, are there other instances or areas around the world where the Catholic Church was influential in dictating the treatment of slaves, or was it solely seen in Cuba?
The back around the 11th or 12th century, I can't remember which century it was. The leaders of the Catholic Church got together, put together some laws or codes or policy called the Justinian codes, and they were essentially policies by which they would like to see various governmental leaders govern, and including that was slavery. So wherever there was Catholicism, whatever Catholic country you had, the Catholic Church was heavily involved with the leadership, heavily involved with policies, help making laws, what have you. In other words, the Catholic Church was quite influential. So Cuba was certainly a place where the Catholic Church is probably most influential, but Brazil is another. Brazil was Portuguese, and they pretty much had the same laws as the Catholic Church did. For example, marriage. I said Cuba. Cuba did. For example, marriage. In the United States, marriage was not necessarily encouraged because to get married, you had to sign a contract, basically a contract, and blacks were not allowed to get involved in contracts. So there were marriages in the United States, and the vows and the marital vows were changed to till death or distance do you part. And that was one of the big differences in Cuba. Now, same thing in Brazil, people were encouraged to get married. The problem that Brazil had was there was this huge area, not enough priests to go around. So you had a lot of common law marriages. In Cuba, people were encouraged to get married. Brazil, they were too, if that is, a priest lived nearby. In many respects, the treatment of slaves in Brazil resembled the treatment of slaves in the United States. The problem that they had in Brazil, though, as far as slave owners are concerned, was that Brazil heavily forested. There are a lot of runaway slave communities that, truth of the matter is, the slave owners could not find. And if they ever did find it, then they'd be accosted seriously. There'd be a lot of physical damage done to slave catchers or slave owners. But Brazil certainly, though, was a place, though, where you did have where the Catholic Church was involved and slavery. The policies towards slavery were enforced at least as much as possible. But it's more of a new world thing when it comes to that, because over in Europe, you'll find here that you did not have black slavery there like we had over in the New World. So basically, looking at Cuba and Brazil.
Right, and so you said the policies are pretty much the same in Brazil and Cuba, but if you look at Europe, was there a condemnation of slavery by the Catholic Church, and was it just was there ever a time when the Catholic Church, condemned slavery? Were they behind on it? Was it one of those things where the church itself had a belief in slavery as it existed in the New World that Catholics kind of ignored? Or what are your thoughts or opinions or facts on that?
Good question. It's a tough question. There we go. So I'm not familiar with the inner workings of the Catholic Church in that regard, but I do know, though, that when they put together these policy Justinian codes, there was a recognition that slavery existed. And so with all that, though, what they tried to do was see to it that slaves were treated in as humanely a way as possible. Therefore, you could not overdo it when it came to punishment. You could not break up families. You had to encourage them to get married. So therefore, you find that there were attempts, in Cuba especially, successful attempts for the most part, to try to at least treat slaves fairly. Brazil, being more isolated, being larger, they were not as successful. But so the church really never really got involved with slavery, at least as far as abolishing slavery, or never really made its attitude known. The Justinian codes, though, recognized the reality that slavery existed.
All right, and so I'm just I wonder, I mean, I might look into myself, but if I imagine that since Catholic Church had their own rules and regulation, or rules on slavery, if they had very specific terms or situations in which slavery, like I guess servitude, was condemned or not. So I imagine that in in the New World, American slavery, those practices are probably condemned or would be condemned, or possibly were condemned. I wonder if the Catholic Church had certain situations in which slavery was, or servitude was, regulated or not necessarily condemned itself. Just because I know that the Christian Church was birthed at in a time of slavery. So I just assumed that it might have been just a way of life or the way of the world when they came into existence. I wonder if there's some sort of exception there. And so the next question, I know that we'll be getting into the civil rights movement eventually. I have no idea how many episodes down the line that is, but towards the end of episode 2, you mentioned that MLK may not have been the most important person during the civil rights movement, but definitely the most, I guess, visual, and he was the face of it. I guess you can go into a little bit of foreshadowing of, I guess, some big names who may not be as recognized. You don't have to go too in depth, but anything just to kind of, set people up for what will come eventually.
Yeah, not to minimize the importance of Martin Luther King, but I do think he stood on the shoulders of a number of individuals. But when it came to importance, I think the most important person was Thurgood Marshall. King certainly raised a lot of important issues, and because of his visibility, and his strategy, for the most part, actually was very good with regard to nonviolent resistance. The importance of King in this sense, and I say it was important because of the fact that television was just kicking in, and the civil rights movement had two significant allies. One, the help of white Americans. The men and women who were white were big when it came to civil rights movement. Just like Truth Matters, Black Lives Matter really needs white allies as well. So that was the first thing. Second thing was television. Television just started to kick in. And so people would sit down, and this novelty called television, they sit there and eat their dinner, and the 6 or 7 o'clock news would come on, and they would see what's happening in the South. And so fire hoses being sicked on people, and police dogs were sicked on people, on protesters. And so you had individuals who were fence sitters or maybe even leaned toward segregation, but they saw the treatment of Black people in the South and saw they were not fighting back. And so the sympathies began to shift toward Black Americans. Right? So that was what King did that was really so important. But I think that in the end, the most important person was Thurgood Marshall. Marshall was a lawyer, and he was the one who litigated these things. And long before Martin Luther King got started, Thurgood Marshall was in court trying a variety of cases that dealt with discrimination. And just like King, his life was constantly being threatened. Marshall argued 32 cases before the Supreme Court, 129. He was a brilliant lawyer. And so, one of King's more famous protests was the Montgomery bus boycott. But it wasn't the boycott that changed the way things were done in the South. Marshall went to court and got the Supreme Court to agree that what Montgomery, Alabama, and other southern cities were doing should not be done. That it was unconstitutional, and that's what ended the Montgomery bus boycott. So Marshall, therefore, I think was so important. Then after he left, and then he became a judge, and so as a judge, before he went to the Supreme Court, he probably had 112 cases that were appealed to a higher court, and none of his decisions were overturned. So he was an exceptional judge in that regard as well. And civil rights really was his baby in many respects. And he was the guy who made a lot of things that Martin Luther King did possible. And so I think that Thurgood Marshall really was the most important person in the civil rights movement. It's just that he was more behind the scenes, if you will, because he was in court, whereas King, of course, was visible.
Okay, that makes sense. I think that, I mean, even today, Black Lives Matters, the image, we don't really have a face in, I guess, contemporary protests, but I mean, all we're kind of demanding right now is for that legal change. So I know that's kind of the struggle, and that's kind of what everyone's kind of crying out for right now, that we're not really getting. So I see that, we kind of need a Thurgood, or, I guess we need allies to kind of step up in that regard. All right, so next week we did a lead up, and so I think that it just makes sense to go into Civil War then, and we can start that off in, I guess, 1861, or do you want to start with Lincoln right before Lincoln's election, or we can start during?
Well, yeah, we can start out with before the election, because we have to get into the Confederacy and the Confederate Constitution.
All right, cool. So, all right, so can't wait for that. Let's see you next week then. All right, thanks everyone.
Okay, thank you.